Before the ceremony began, everyone saw a bride broken by fate, but no one predicted the night that would rewrite her life. The drums in Amara's village beat slowly that morning, echoing like a reluctant heartbeat. The sound rolled through cracked walls, across red dust roads, and into every home where gossip had already spread like wildfire. People gathered in small clusters under the sun, whispering about the girl whose father had sold her future for debt. Their voices carried both pity and scorn. "She was beautiful once, that Amara," said one woman, grinding pepper in a wooden bowl. "But beauty is useless when your father owes the landlord." Another replied, "A disabled beggar? What kind of curse is this marriage?" The wind carried their words, and each one seemed to strike Amara's heart harder than the last. Inside a small clay house at the edge of the village, Amara stood before a cracked mirror, her reflection shimmering with sweat and disbelief. She was barely 20, slender and tall, with eyes that had once been full of mischief and light. Now they were swollen from sleepless nights and silent tears. Her white wrapper was simple, borrowed from a cousin, and her hair was tied in a scarf that carried the faint scent of palm oil and sorrow. Behind her, her mother coughed weakly on a woven mat, her thin hand trembling as she tried to lift a calabash bowl to her lips. The woman's eyes, dimmed by sickness, found her daughter's reflection and filled with unspoken apology. In the next room, Amara's father sat bent over a wooden stool, head in his hands. His clothes hung loose, his beard unkempt, his spirit broken. The debt collector's visit the night before had left more than threats. It had left shame. The only way to keep their roof from being taken was to accept an offer made in desperation. His daughter's hand in marriage to a man everyone mocked. A man named Kofi. The name alone drew ridicule. Kofi the beggar. A crippled man who wheeled himself along the roadside, singing soft hymns to strangers for coins. He had once been something else. People said, a teacher, a trader, a man with dreams. But life had broken him like dry wood underfoot, leaving behind only the shadow that begged in dust and heat. When her father called her name that morning, Amara's hands trembled so violently that she spilled the water she was holding. He did not look her in the eye when he said the words. "It's done," he murmured, his voice trembling. "He will take care of you. The debt will be forgiven. This is God's will." She stared at him, trying to find any sign of remorse, but saw only exhaustion. Her mother wept quietly behind the curtain, her frail body shaking with the sound. The choice was no longer hers. The girl who once dreamed of teaching children, who loved to sing by the river, was now to be handed to a man who begged at the market gate. By midday, the villagers gathered under the baobab tree. The air was heavy with dust and judgment. Children pressed forward to see the strange couple. Elders stood back, arms folded, their silence louder than any insult. Amara stood beside Kofi, her body stiff, her chin trembling. He sat in his chair, a battered, rusted contraption with squeaking wheels and one broken handle. His legs were thin, wrapped in faded cloth, but his upper body was upright, his expression strangely serene. When he looked up at her, there was no pity in his eyes, only an unsettling calm, as though he knew something that no one else did. The ceremony was short, performed by an old village elder who seemed eager to end the spectacle. As the prayers were recited, Amara's heart sank with every word. The ring, a thin copper band, slipped onto her finger with a faint metallic whisper. The villagers muttered under their breath, some shaking their heads, others hiding their laughter. A goat bleated somewhere in the distance, and the sound felt mocking, cruel. The final blessing echoed into silence. And just like that, it was done. The beggar had a bride. The debt was erased. The village had a new story to tell. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, Amara's friends avoided her gaze. Her father stood still, his eyes watery but empty. Her mother tried to approach, but was pulled back by relatives who muttered that the new bride must go to her husband's home without turning back. So Amara followed Kofi, each step heavier than the last. He moved slowly, pushing his chair along the rough path, the wheels groaning over gravel. Villagers watched from doorways as they passed, some curious, some cruel, some silently grieving. Dust clung to the hem of her wrapper. Each roll of his wheel sounded like the closing of a door behind her. Kofi's home stood on the outskirts of the village, a small mud house with a sagging roof, one window, and a wooden bed that creaked with every breeze. The air inside smelled of smoke and damp earth. A single oil lamp flickered on a stool beside the bed. Amara set down her small bundle of clothes, her fingers tracing the cracks on the wall. She did not speak. Kofi watched her for a long moment before saying quietly, "You don't owe me fear." His voice was soft, unexpected. She did not answer. He nodded once and turned his chair toward the window, looking out into the night as though searching for something beyond the darkness. Outside, the village feasted. Drums beat again, laughter rose from the distance, but none of it belonged to them. Inside the room, silence reigned, thick, almost sacred. Amara sat on the edge of the bed, her thoughts unraveling in endless loops. She felt trapped between resentment and curiosity. Who was this man who sat so quietly, who showed no anger, no shame? What secret sat behind his calm eyes? She glanced again at him, his profile lit by the lamp's glow, his expression unreadable, and felt a strange chill run down her spine. When he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "Amara," he said, her name sounding unfamiliar in his mouth. "The world thinks I am nothing, but not everything you see is broken." She turned toward him, startled. Before she could respond, he moved his chair closer to the bed, blew out the lamp, and the room fell into darkness. The only sound was the slow rasp of his breath and the steady beating of her heart. When the silence stretched too long, Amara reached for her pillow, seeking comfort in its coolness. But her hand brushed something sharp beneath the cloth. Frowning, she lifted it and found a folded piece of paper pinned onto the fabric. Her fingers hesitated before opening it. Inside, written in firm, uneven handwriting, were 6 words that made her blood run cold. "I have more than you imagine." She stared at the words, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean? Gold? Secrets? A lie?" The lamp flickered again, as if answering, casting strange shadows on the wall. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. Amara's world, already fragile, tilted on its axis. Whatever her father had sold her into, it was not what it seemed. The note trembled in her hand, a promise and a threat both. That night, as the rain began to fall, Amara realized her life's greatest battle had only just begun. That night, as Amara walked into the lantern-lit room beside her new husband, she found a hidden note pinned beneath his pillow. One line that would undo everything she thought she knew. "Some wounds are carved not by swords, but by whispers," and hers started long before the wedding bells. The morning sun rose reluctantly over the village. Its light filtered through a haze of red dust and unspoken judgment. The scent of roasted yam mixed with gossip, drifting through the air like invisible smoke. Every path, every doorway seemed to hold a watcher, every voice a verdict. Amara could feel their eyes on her even before she stepped outside, the weight of pity and mockery pressing against her like a second skin. Her mother had tried to comfort her, resting a trembling hand on her shoulder, whispering that obedience was better than defiance. But the words tasted like ashes. There was no comfort in surrender, no peace in humiliation. She was not walking toward love. She was walking toward shame. By the time the wedding procession began, the heat was heavy, the air almost still. The drums beat a slow, uncertain rhythm, lacking joy. At the center of it all, Amara walked barefoot beside her father, her white wrapper brushing the earth, her head bowed. Behind her, the women murmured, half in prayer, half in disbelief. Ahead of her, the sound of creaking metal wheels approached. Kofi's wheelchair appeared at the turn of the road, pushed by 2 boys barely in their teens. The chair was old, its handles rusted, its wooden seat patched with rope. Yet Kofi sat tall, his clothes simple but clean, his expression unshaken. When he caught sight of Amara, his eyes softened, not with triumph, but with a strange kind of peace. It made her uneasy. Children pointed at him from the crowd. One whispered loudly, "Mama, is that the man she's marrying?" The mother pulled the boy's hand down, but not fast enough to hide the smirk that followed. Men laughed quietly behind folded arms. Women shook their heads. Someone muttered, She's paying her father's debts in shame. Another added, better to die unmarried than to wed a cripple. The words sliced through the humid air and sank deep into Amara's chest. She walked slower, each step heavier than the last. When she reached the makeshift altar under the old baobab tree, the priest stood waiting with his leather-bound book, sweat glistening on his forehead. His voice was steady, but the tremor in his hand betrayed discomfort. He read the vows in a tone that lacked conviction, his gaze flickering between the bride and the groom, as if silently questioning the union himself. Amara repeated her words in a whisper, her voice fragile, barely audible over the shuffling of restless feet. Kofi's voice, by contrast, was clear, measured, calm, carrying a quiet strength that silenced even the murmurs for a fleeting moment. When he said, "I do," it was not desperation, it was declaration. Yet for Amara, the ceremony fell hollow. Every blessing sounded like mockery, every prayer like a curse disguised in scripture. The copper ring slipped coldly onto her finger, and she could not bring herself to look at Kofi. When the priest declared them husband and wife, the applause that followed was hesitant, scattered. Less celebration, more curiosity. Her father stood apart, face pale, eyes wet with regret he did not dare voice. The villagers watched with that cruel fascination reserved for spectacles they secretly crave, a tragedy unfolding in slow motion. As they left the altar, Kofi reached for her hand. His touch was gentle, uncertain, a silent offering of peace. But Amara, her heart swelling with humiliation, pulled her hand away before anyone could see. The gesture was small, but it rippled like a stone thrown into still water. Kofi said nothing. He only nodded, his expression unreadable. The quiet dignity in his restraint angered her more than if he had spoken. How could he be so calm when her world was collapsing? When they arrived at his small home, a one-room dwelling with a clay stove in the corner and faded mats on the floor, Amara felt the full distance she had fallen. From her family's compound, with its cracked but proud walls, to this place of shadows and poverty. Kofi rolled himself to the window and began to light a small kerosene lamp. The flame flickered, throwing golden patterns against the rough walls. Amara stood by the doorway, her bundle of clothes at her feet, staring at the unfamiliar space that was now her life. He spoke softly, his voice as calm as before. "You can sit, Amara. The floor won't swallow you." She turned toward him sharply, her shame hardening into anger. "Don't speak to me as if you know me," she snapped. He said nothing more. The lamp burned lower, the silence between them thick and aching. That night, Amara lay on the far edge of the bed, her back to him. The mat creaked with every movement. Outside, the night insects sang their endless, lonely hymn. She thought of her friends, how they must be laughing now, imagining her beside a beggar, trapped in this room. She thought of her father's bowed head and her mother's hollow eyes. The weight of their choices pressed on her chest like a stone. Tears came, silent and bitter. In the darkness, she whispered to herself, "I will not let this be my life." Days turned to weeks, and the pattern of rejection deepened. Kofi would leave every morning for the market, his small tin cup hanging from his chair, his blanket folded neatly across his lap. He asked her once to come with him, to sit near the temple steps and sing hymns for small coins, to ease their burden. She refused without hesitation. "I will not beg beside you," she said coldly. "I may be forced to live here, but I will not wear your shame." The word struck him harder than she expected. For a moment, she saw pain flicker in his eyes, but then it vanished, replaced by that same calm. "As you wish," he said simply. Amara stayed indoors most days, sweeping floors that did not need cleaning, cooking food she barely touched. When neighbors visited, she pretended not to hear them knock. At night, when Kofi returned with his day's earnings, he would place a small plate of roasted corn or plantain near her side and eat quietly. She never thanked him. The silence between them grew until it filled the room like smoke. Yet beneath that silence, something stirred. Curiosity, unease, the faintest spark of intrigue. Because for all his quiet, Kofi never looked defeated. He was not a man begging for pity. He carried himself like someone hiding something. He spent hours at night, writing in a small notebook, his hand moving quickly across the page before tucking it beneath his pillow. One evening, when the air was thick and the lantern's flame danced low, Amara found herself unable to sleep. The sound of Kofi's pen scratching paper had stopped, replaced by a soft, rhythmic tapping. Then his voice, a whisper in the dark. "I know the secret you'll never believe," he said. Her heart froze. She turned slightly, eyes wide in the half-light, but before she could ask, the lamp sputtered and died, drowning the room in blackness. Only his breathing, steady and deliberate, filled the silence. Outside, the wind rose, whispering through the cracks in the wall. The secret, whatever it was, hung between them, unspoken, unseen, and already dangerous. On their first night together, Amara hears Kofi whisper in the dark, "I know the secret you'll never believe." And the room goes black. When you are judged unworthy of love and respect, you begin to find your own meaning in the shadows. The door to their modest home creaked behind Amara as she stepped inside, the weight of yesterday's shame still pressing against her shoulders. The room was smaller than she had imagined. Cracked plaster peeling from the walls, a single kerosene lamp perched on a rickety stool, and a thin blanket, frail and threadbare, spread across a mattress that groaned with despair. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, of lingering cigarette smoke from Kofi's begging nights, of stale breath and silent surrender. Her bundle of clothes sat untouched in a corner, still new and full of hope. Now it felt like an irrelevance in the face of this new life. She paused by the cracked window and stared out at the muddy street below. Kofi's begging seat stood out against the early morning light. His wheels flattened slightly, paint faded, and the tin cup hanging from the side rattled softly as someone passed. She watched him in the distance, rolling into place, greeting the few who offered coins with a nod, collecting the scraps of pity the world was willing to give. A bitter resentment filled her chest. The man she was forced to marry had this world as his domain, a pavement of pity and survival, while she had once walked paths of promise and expectation. The shift stung like a lash. She tried to escape by returning to the place she called home, to the family who once loved her. At dawn she rose, her heart caught between humiliation and longing, and walked the dusty road back to her father's house. The feet of welcome she expected never came. The gate was closed. Her mother lay weak beneath the mango tree, coughing, her eyes full of sorrow, but also distance. Her father's silhouette leaned over a stool, his face hidden in his hands. When she said her name, the villagers nearby turned and formed a protective circle of silence around him. Children whispered behind their hands. Women shook their heads. She offered no explanation, no plea. She gathered her courage, swallowed her tears, and walked back. The life she tried to reclaim refused to accept her. In the days that followed, the whispers trailed her like shadows. At the market, she carried water jars, balanced on her head, while the stallholders paused mid-conversation to watch. "There she is," one woman muttered, "the one who married a cripple." A child tugged his mother's skirt, asked, "Is that the lady with the beggar husband?" The mother shushed him, but the damage was done. Each step through the crowd was a question etched into her skin. Her reflection in market mirrors showed a young woman whose eyes flickered with anger and defeat, her blouse modest, her skirt plain. She had traded her wrapper of hope for a uniform of survival. Amara's nights were the worst. She lay awake on the thin mattress, the blanket pulled high, listening to the creak of the uneven floorboards, the wind sighing through the cracks in the window, the distant hoot of an owl. Kofi's wheelchair sat beside the bed, silent. She wanted to cry, but the tears refused her body's permission. Instead, she turned her back to the darkness, arms crossed, lips pressed hard until they cracked. The shame of being marketed as a bride to pay her father's debts, the bitterness of living with a man society scorned, not loved, wrapped around her like a shroud. But beneath it, something else pressed, a subtle recognition of what it meant to survive. Kofi approached her one evening after his return from the streets. His coat was dusty. His hands trembled with exhaustion. He found her standing by the window, tears silent behind her lashes. Without a word, he removed his coat and draped it around her shoulders. The fabric smelled of oil and concrete, of gutters and waiting. She froze, the gesture simple yet profound. He then divided his meager meal of boiled yam and water, the larger portion going to her. "You rest," he said quietly, words low but steady. Amara looked at him, confusion rising. She had expected pity, or even anger. Instead, she found a man who refused to collapse beneath the world's verdict. She did not reach out, but she noticed, and something inside her began to shift. Still, she could not escape the longing for her past. The school benches, the songs by the river, the laughter with friends. One day she packed her bundle again and walked to the bus stop. She boarded the bus, head low. The ride rattled through the city, past foreign shops and tall buildings. She reached a district she recognized and knocked on the door of her former teacher's home. The teacher opened and looked at her uniformed figure and her husband's wheelchair visible outside. "Amara," he asked gently. She nodded. Inside, she told part of the story, hoping for comfort. Her teacher held her hand, pressed something into it, a small envelope of money. "You can start again," he said. Amara thanked him. But as she walked away, the villagers nearby stared, the whispers returned. Back from the beggar's wife. She realized then that running back only landed her in the same shame. Late one night the wind was uproaring and rain tapped against the thin roof. Amara padded to the window, pulling aside the curtain. In the dim glow, she saw Kofi's chair tipped over, the tin cup empty, old coins scattered on the pavement. The pouch where he kept offerings torn open, contents missing. She stepped outside barefoot and crouched beside the chair, the cold seeping into her knees. Through trembling fingers she sifted the coins and found something unexpected. Beneath the scattered change was a bank receipt printed by a city bank, dated the following morning, with a deposit of a large amount listed under Kofi's account. The name on the receipt was unfamiliar. Her breath caught. Her heart pounded. She looked around the dark street, the broken padlock still hanging from the seat, a set of new wheels placed nearby. It was a message or a setup. Whatever it was, it changed everything she believed. Amara gathered the receipt, folded it in her palm, and returned inside. Kofi sat in his chair, watching the lamp's flame wavering. He met her eyes. She did not speak. He did not smile. The secret lay between them now, unstated, powerful, dangerous. The walls of their modest home, once merely prison, had become the burying ground of truth. The wilderness of loneliness and shame had shifted into the wilderness of revelation. Her world had changed, not yet for the better, but irreversibly. Late one night, Amara discovers Kofi's begging seat has been broken into, and inside his pouch, she finds a bank receipt with a large sum of money, dated the very next day. Her heart asked one question: stay silent and safe, or speak truth and risk everything? Amara woke quietly in the pre-dawn darkness, the low kerosene lamp flickering beside her bed, casting wavering shadows across the cracked wall of the small room she now shared with Kofi. She lay still for a moment, listening to the steady hum of waking life in the village outside, the paired cocks crowing, the women drawing water, the children's bare feet tapping dust. Inside, though, she felt something raw and stirring. The receipt she had found the night before, folded and hidden beneath her apron, pressed against her hip like a balm. She rose and slipped in her wrapper, moving across the room, where Kofi lay sleep-seated in his wheelchair, his breathing steady and calm. He didn't stir. Amara's throat tightened. Questions swamped her. Who gave him money? Why was a beggar given a bank deposit? And what did it mean for her, his wife, his silent partner in scandal? She approached him quietly, holding the receipt in her palm like a torch in the dark. "Kofi," she said softly, "what is this?" He opened his eyes slowly, looked at the paper, then at her. "I cannot tell you yet," he replied, voice even, "but I did not earn it in the street." The words landed like stones in her chest. She stayed silent a moment. Her mind raced. The money, large sum, official bank print, deposit date tomorrow. Beggar's seat broken into. Someone watching. Someone deciding his fate. And her involvement, once passive, now demanded a choice. Inside her, a battle began. On one side, the familiar voice of her family, the villagers, the tradition that had forced her into this marriage. You were given away. You accepted. You obeyed. Stay quiet. On the other side, a new voice. Her own dignity, her own sense that she was worth more than pity, worth partnership, worth truth. She walked to the window and looked at Kofi rolling himself out into the morning sun, his tin cup raised, coins dropped in by sympathetic passers-by. She watched his body pushed across concrete by the momentum of social charity. Her heart clenched. That could be them, both of them, but now the receipt changed the equation. Later that morning, she visited the village elder, her head bowed in the compound, her wrapper modest compared to the elder's robes, her shoes dusty. The elder sat beneath the banyan tree, his face stern with tradition. "You married a beggar, Amara," he said without warmth. "Your role is known. Mind your place." The words weighed more than any whip. Amara raised her chin, but did not speak. The elder's words hung in the air, bulldozing her pride and reminding her how little social currency her status now held. Beside the tree, villagers watched silently. They had an audience now. She left, her wrapper fluttering in the wind, her heart heavier. That afternoon, she tried to return the money. She went to the donor, a middle-aged man in a crisp shirt, polished shoes, and guarded expression. She handed him the receipt and said, "I cannot keep this. It is too much." He looked at her like one might examine a rare bird, then shook his head. "It is for him," he said. "It was meant to free him." Her breath caught. "Free him," she whispered. He nodded. "He is not merely a beggar. Perhaps he will walk again. Perhaps something greater." She stared at him, her stomach twisting. The words offered hope and threatening possibility. "Then I must go back," she said quietly, "and live with the shame of your donation." The donor's silence pressed on her more than any insult. She left with the receipt in her hand, the weight of choice pressing down like the midday sun on the market stalls. By evening, the heat softened and they sat together on the porch of the small home, the day's dust still clinging to their backs. Kofi turned his wheelchair toward her, his face calm. "You must decide," he said softly. "I will accept whatever you choose." Amara's eyes flicked away. "I didn't marry you to manage your charity account," she said bitterly. "I married you because I had no choice. Now I am expected to live it." He lowered his gaze and then met her eyes. "I married you because I chose you, even if the world did not. And this money may be our door, if we walk it together." The final word hung in the air. She felt tears rise, but pride stopped them. She stood, crossed the threshold, and walked into the night, leaving the door open behind her, so the house creaked softly in protest. That night, Amara lay wide-eyed again, the receipt on the bedside table, the kerosene lamp flickering. Her mind raced between futures, one of silence, acceptance, returning to the begging seat beside Kofi, no questions asked, the other of departure, reclaiming her father's land, returning to the classroom she once imagined for herself, using the money to buy her undoing. She thought of the children in the village who once called her friend, now strangers. She thought of the mother who ignored her at the return visit. She thought of Kofi, his wheelchair, his dignity. She thought of the receipt. She realized that no matter which path she chose, the map had changed. In the dead of night, she reached out, picked up the receipt, and held it close. Outside the low window, the wind stirred, and the wheelchair's wheels creaked when Kofi rolled out for a moment, then returned. She paused on the bed and heard the scrape of metal against wood. She drifted towards sleep on trembling limbs, only to wake with a violent start. The wheelchair was missing from its place by the bed. The floorboards bore scuff marks leading toward the door. The tin cup was gone, and the receipt, her proof, her dilemma, taken. A chilling emptiness filled the room. In that moment, Amara understood. The test was no longer about money. It was about truth, about what she would do when the ground beneath her moved. She sat up, the lamp guttering, shadows dancing across the walls. The silence pressed down on her, and she realized the next step would not be easy. It would demand courage she did not yet know she possessed. As Amara sleeps, she wakes to Kofi missing, his wheelchair overturned by the door, and the receipt gone. Even a tiny flame can light a dark room, if someone cares enough to strike the match. Amara awoke before dawn, the faint gray light creeping in through the cracked window of the modest one-room house she shared with Kofi. She lay still for a moment, listening to the distant call of the roosters, the hush of the village stirring into motion. The room, dim and musty, bore the weight of her new life. Cracked walls stained by damp, a thin, ragged blanket thrown over the sagging mattress, oil lamps sputtering softly on a stool beside Kofi's wheelchair. She felt the chill of regret slip across her skin as she rose quietly, adjusting her simple wrapper and stepping out into the coarse floor. Outside, the early morning air felt sharper than it ever had, bitter with hope and memory. She watched Kofi roll himself down the rough path toward his begging spot, his wheelchair's wheels groaning like old timber. Amara's throat tightened at the sight. Here was the man she married, someone she once tolerated, now moving with resolve. The tear of the world placed him at pavement level, yet something in his posture invited respect. His tin cup lay open on the ground, coins spared, his face calm as he greeted passers-by. Amara backed into the doorway, so that no one would see her tears. The poverty, the judgment, the forced marriage, all crowded her mind. And yet this man, this beggar, was not broken. Later, when a knock came at the door, she answered with caution. A woman stood beyond the frame, a physiotherapist from the nearby town named Martha. She wore a white coat over a plain dress, a stethoscope slung loosely around her neck, her hair tied back with understated precision. She carried a leather bag that looked far too clean for their home. "Amara," she said gently, "I've come about your husband. I believe he can walk again." The words seemed foreign to Amara's ears. Walk again? She met Martha's eyes and saw something she hadn't felt in weeks. Possibility. The woman entered their home, her eyes measuring the space. Low ceilings, scarred walls, the wheelchair in the center. She turned to Kofi first. He watched her quietly. Then to Amara. "I know this life asks too much of you both. Let me offer you a way forward." Amara nodded slowly, unsure. In that moment, the first spark of hope lit inside her. Over the next few days, Martha visited regularly. Each afternoon, she brought simple tools. Length of smooth wood as a leg brace, elastic bands cut from old clothing, fishing line for pulley systems. She laid them on the mat outdoors, raw tools for a raw purpose. Amara sat in a chair nearby, arms folded, observing with stiff detachment. Kofi lay on the mat, his thin legs bound by straps, his hands gripping the wooden brace. Sweat dripped down his face. The world that called him beggar now watched him struggle to stand. Martha coached him. "Lift your hips. Press down. Keep your shoulders back." And Kofi obeyed. Amara watched him falter. He tipped, and the brace slipped. He gasped. Martha adjusted his posture, spoke gently, and Amara found herself offering a hand. "Here." The word slipped out before her mind caught it. Kofi looked at her, surprise in his eyes. They worked together to set the brace. The chair waited behind him as safety, but he didn't reach for it. For the first time, Amara felt pride. Not in herself, but in him. Night after night, the machine of hope turned and churned. Amara's resentment softened. She remembered the coat he gave her, the meal he divided. She remembered her father's shame, the villagers' whispers. She realized that Kofi's dignity was not bought. It had always been there. The tools, the workouts, the sweat. They began to transform more than his body. They began to transform her world. One evening, as dusk tinted the sky silver, Martha insisted they try something new, the wooden brace removed. Kofi stood by the wheelchair's arms, hands pressed against them. He inhaled. Then he released. With trembling legs, he took one step, 2 steps, unsupported. Amara gasped. Martha clapped softly, but her eyes glowed. For the few seconds he stood upright without brace or chair, time bent. The birds ceased their calls for a moment. The villagers paused in nearby homes, curious. In that brief victory, hope bloomed. Afterward, Amara helped push the wheelchair back and guided Kofi inside. The walls of the small room felt different, smaller, somehow contained, yet full. Kofi collapsed quietly onto his bed, exhaustion in every line of his body. He nodded to Amara. "Thank you," he said quietly. She didn't reply, but her heart said it. That night, for the first time, she laid beside him, not in pity, not in resentment, but in shared fear and possibility. The next morning, the street outside their house lay still. The early sun glinted off the tin roofs, but no passerby stopped at the begging spot. Amara stepped outside to check. The wheelchair sat alone, the tin cup empty. Then, something frightening. Clipped to the gate was a folded news flyer, bold print. Local disabled man promised walks again. Scam? Beggar's secret revealed. Her breath caught. The words screamed beneath the calm morning. What had they done? Was the donation, the work, the transformation going to be exposed? Would the village again point fingers, condemn them both? Amara stared at the flyer, fear and resolve battling. The spark she had helped ignite lifted one flicker higher, but the wind was coming. She folded the paper, gathered her resolve, and looked at Kofi's wheelchair, his face still calm, his body scarred, his spirit unbroken. The journey was no longer hidden. It had become public, and she realized, to walk again, they must face the world together. The next morning the street is silent, and a news flyer is left outside their door. Local disabled man promised walks again. Scam? Beggar's secret revealed. The world didn't change, but her posture did. Morning light filtered through the palm-thatched roofs of the village as Amara stepped onto the dusty path that led to the market. The air was thick with the scent of roasting yams and the chatter of stall keepers preparing for another day of survival. But this morning something inside Amara was shifting. She stood beside Kofi, her husband, once derided, now walking. He rose from his wheelchair with a slow grace, his legs trembling but unbroken, and took a step forward, then another, unsupported. The crowd paused. The tin cup by his empty chair sat untouched. Villagers stared. Mouths fell open. Amara's heart raced, not with shame but with a fierce surge of pride she did not expect. She planted her feet firmly beside him as he walked across the rough stones, his back straight, every movement deliberate. A woman tumbled her basket of tomatoes when she saw him stand. A young boy dropped his stick. The world held its breath. Then, as if reluctant to believe, a clap broke out among two women. A hush, followed by whispers. Isn't that the beggar's wife? But when Kofi lifted his head and smiled at Amara, that whisper faltered. For the first time Amara realized she was no longer invisible behind him. She was present and seen. The market day advanced, vendors calling out, goats bleating, children tugging at their mothers. Amara and Kofi walked together along the stalls. He nodded to the blacksmith. He greeted the tail teaser. He accepted a small handful of coins from a sympathetic passerby. She stood tall, her wrapper dust-damaged but clean. Her eyes met the stares but did not drop. The vendors glanced at her differently now, not with pity, not with scorn, but with curiosity. Her spine straightened. Her role shifted from burden-bearer to partner. Back home, the small house they shared seemed alive with the echo of what had happened. Amara unpacked the bundle of clothes her father had gifted and touched them with new vision. No longer tokens of sacrifice, but remnants of transformation. That afternoon, she approached the mission school under the large baobab tree and enrolled for adult education. The blackboard and chalk that once seemed beyond her reach were now gateways. She sat among older women, wives, helpers, girls who once left school early, and copied letters slowly. ABC. She wrote simple words. I am. Her fingers faltered, but they did not stop. When the teacher smiled and nodded, she felt a flame kindle inside. Meanwhile, Kofi became her tutor. One late evening, on the cracked concrete outside their home, he spread a slate with chalk. He drew lines. Amara Kofi we. Amara knelt beside him, tracing her name with her finger, then his. He placed his hand gently on hers. Your name matters, he said softly, his voice steady though his body still shook. The wheels of his chair stood behind him like a relic. She looked up, meeting his gaze. For the first time she felt the shared promise between them, not of escape, but of ascendancy together. The transformation reached public notice when a visiting dignitary arrived unannounced in the village. He drove a polished vehicle into the dusty square and walked among the stalls, his presence silencing the chatter. At the edge of the crowd stood Amara, clutching a worn cloth bag, and Kofi, leaning on the back of his chair. The dignitary approached them. He looked at Amara and applauded quietly. You must be his manager, he said, addressing her directly. You've done a wonderful job. The words landed like thunder in Amara's chest. She looked at Kofi. He nodded, humble. The villagers watched with new eyes. She felt their gaze shift from pity to respect. In that moment, she realized that their partnership had been reframed, not as a charity case, but as equal agents of change. That night, under the yellow glow of the oil lamp, Amara sat on the small bed beside Kofi. She held the diploma of enrollment in her lap, the chalk dust still under her nails. She looked at the letter lying sealed on the stool, a letter bearing the initials AN and the official stamp of a foundation. She opened it slowly and read, "Award for Early Rehabilitation Beggar Program." Her breath caught. The letter invited Kofi to a public ceremony and offered recognition for his progress. A wave of emotions surged: pride, fear, hope. This was not just their victory, it was now visible. Morning came, and the street outside their home was silent when they stepped out. The wheelchair sat quietly under the mango tree. Kofi's wheels gleamed faintly in the dawn light. A flyer lay by the doorstep. Local disabled man promised walk again. Scam? Beggar's secret revealed. Amara picked it up. The word stabbed at the victory. Recognition, yes, but also suspicion. The world was watching now, and not just with admiration but with doubt. Kofi stood beside her, his body upright, his expression calm. She met his eyes. The uphill path was not over. It had risen another step, and now demanded even more from them. Amara's posture had changed. She carried herself differently, head held higher, voice quieter but sure. The world around her did not yet alter. The market stalls remained the same. The villagers' whispers still echoed, but something inside shifted irrevocably. She no longer stood at the threshold of hope. She had stepped into it. Late evening, a letter arrives for Kofi, bearing the initials AN and the official stamp of a foundation. Award for Early Rehabilitation Beggar Program. The foundation requires a public ceremony. When you climb higher in faith, sometimes you're pulled down by the cords of someone else's fear. The morning of the ceremony arrived in a silence that felt more tense than triumphant. The village clearing had been transformed. White tents flanked the makeshift stage. Colorful banners fluttered overhead reading, "From Beggar to Walking Man," and rows of benches held the villagers, guests from the district, and a small press contingent. Amara stood behind the rows, beside Kofi, her heart climbing and then hitching. He had practiced his steps. The brace had been removed. The wheelchair kept discreetly behind him as a mark of his past. In every face, she saw expectancy, pride, but also suspicion, because miracles in this world are often measured against what others want to believe. Kofi wheeled himself to center stage, paused, then slowly braced and rose. A ripple of applause followed. Martha, the physiotherapist, stood at the side with a quiet smile. Amara clapped too, tears threatening, her wrapper swaying in the warm breeze. For a moment, they held each other's gaze and shared a wordless affirmation. Here and now, they stood together, above the old labels. But fate held other plans. A sharply dressed journalist rose from the crowd, microphone in hand, and stepped toward the stage. "Sir," he called out, voice cutting through the applause, "many in this region say you're a scam. Why did this beggar receive large funds under the foundation's name? What is the truth about your walk?" The hush that followed felt like a drum of fear. Kofi froze mid-smile, his body stiffening. Amara's breath hitched. The donor, Ian, invited as a benefactor, turned pale, his tie loosening. The villagers leaned forward. The dignitary offering the award looked away. At that moment, the veneer cracked. The donor's cousin, a man with a ledger and too much knowledge, stepped forward. His voice echoed. The funds were part of debt forgiveness for Amara's father, not purely rehabilitation. The foundation's grant is being repurposed. The microphone caught every word. The crowd gasped. Villagers murmured. Kofi's toes curled. Amara's legs refused to support her. The stage lights suddenly felt like search beams, exposing more than they invited. The foundation representative took the microphone. His voice calm but cold. "Effective today, these funds are recalled. Mr. Kofi must return the grant in full by 30 days or face prosecution for fraud." The sound of the words smashed into the clearing like a wrecking ball. The banners fluttered helplessly. The donation that had signaled hope now became a chain of accusation. Amara felt the world tilt. She stood beside Kofi, blind to the stares, deaf to the whispers flooding the benches. The villagers no longer saw the man who walked. They saw the beggar who stood before them broken. The elder who once praised now folded his arms, his expression unreadable. The prophet of their climb shrank into a pit of shame. That evening, Amara returned to the adult education class where she had felt promise. The benches were stacked, the chalkboard wiped clean, the teacher gone. A note pinned to the door read simply, "Closed." She pushed open the door, and a cold wind met her. The hope of learning vanished. Outside, children pointed at her path. "She's back with the cripple again." The whispers rose again like vultures circling threat. Inside the home, Kofi's strength faltered. The brace returned, the wheelchair came forward. His limp returned, more pronounced this time, as though his body refused to carry the weight of humiliation. Amara caught him one evening, collapsed into the chair, sweat beaded on his forehead. She crouched beside him, but he waved her away. The care reversed. For the first time she felt the loneliness she had dismissed earlier. The roles shifted once more. A knock came at the door, a stern landlord entering, ledger in hand. "Rent unpaid 3 months," he said bluntly. "You have 14 days to vacate." The small home that had once been their refuge now felt like a tomb of broken promises. Their few possessions were gathered, packed into unsteady bags. The vendors who once nodded respectfully now ignored them. The guard at the clinic gate no longer held the door. Friends who had visited vanished. The circle shrank. The climb reversed. That night, they returned to the home for the final time. Kofi pushed his chair toward the threshold. Outside, a pair of strong arms removed his crutches from the corner. The sound of metal against wood echoed. A message was taped to the door. "Pay or walk." Amara stared at the scrawled letters, her stomach sink messaging defeat. Kofi rose slowly, leaned over the wheelchair, reached behind for the crutches, and found them gone. He stood as best he could, legs trembling, and took a step. 2, 3, but his body buckled, and he fell into the chair. The spotlight of failure was sudden, harsh. Amara rushed to him, but he raised his hand. "It's not your fault," he said quietly, pain in his eyes more than his limp. She sat beside him. The street beyond held the silhouettes of those who had once whispered praise. Now they watched indifference. The building lights flickered. The night air held the sting of judgment. Kofi drifted out into darkness, his silhouette small and miserably human. She watched him go, his figure limping away under the moonlight, and felt the cords of fear tighten around her own throat. Fear of judgment, failure, exposure. The wreck of success hovered behind them like ghosts. In that moment, she realized that the climb had not defeated the world's standards. It had ignited them, and now they retaliated. She realized that betrayal often comes not from the enemy, but from the mirror, when you look and see what you refuse to accept. In that shared moment of collapse, she understood the cost of hope in a world not ready for change. That night, Kofi's crutches are taken from the room. A message on the door reads, "Pay or walk." Kofi limps into the darkness. Some voices echo louder when you're not around to answer them. The rains came heavy that evening, drawing a veil of gray across the village's rough roads and thin houses. Amara and Kofi arrived at the abandoned shack when the first drops fell, their bodies worn and their hopes eroded by disappointment. The wind tore at their bundle of clothes as they entered the small room. Only one room, corrugated roof patched with tin sheets, walls scarred with water stains and old holes, floor uneven and littered with fragments of leaves and plastic. Inside, the only light came from the moon slanting through missing roof panels, and the air was damp and cold. The hunger in Amara's stomach was a constant clawing, the ache of cold pressing against her ribs. Shame wrapped around her shoulders like a heavy cloak, its folds thick and suffocating. Between them, Kofi sat in his old wheelchair, the chair's wheels caked with mud, and its leather seat cracked with age and disuse. He looked smaller than he had ever been. Amara dropped her small bundle beside the bedstand and sat on the edge of the mattress. The thin blanket hardly covered her legs. She pulled it tighter, though it did little. Outside, the rain hammered the roof and stole any pretense of comfort. She thought of the moment they left the village home, the parents, the landlord, the smiling faces that quickly turned away. She thought of the forced marriage, the supposed promises, the whispers about the beggar's wife. She had tried to escape, she had tried to belong, and now here she was. Homeless again, stripped of dignity, sharing a room with a man everyone pitied instead of respected. The isolation pressed on her. The night deepened. Amara stood and went to the window, pulling aside the thin curtain. She looked down at Kofi's seat outside where he once sat begging, now abandoned in the rain. The tin cup lay empty, the wheels slick with water. The world outside continued, indifferent. She turned away, and the air shook with her voice. I sacrificed myself for you, and this is what we get. The words blasted into the room, echoing off the walls, stirring dust motes into movement. She sank to her knees by the bed, hands on the boundaries of their life now. The ragged blanket, the thin mattress, the wheelchair waiting outside. Tears came, silent but heavy. The shame of giving up her dreams, of being told her worth was in debt repayment, of living in a world that saw them as a joke. They all crowded her mind and heart. Kofi remained seated, silent, watching the tempest of her breakdown. When she finally raised her head, her eyes red and uncomposed, he reached forward and placed his hand on hers. His fingers were rough, his wrist thin, but the pressure was firm. I'm still here, he said, voice steady though his body trembled. She stared at him. For a moment the rain's rhythm merged with her breath. And then she saw him differently. Not the beggar the village whispered about, not the disabled husband she'd been forced to accept, but a man wounded, yes, but standing in his truth. She rose slowly, uncertain, and he wheeled himself beside her. They sat side by side, watching the rain that hammered the roof, each lost inside their own pain. And still his hand held hers. In the early hours of dawn, Amara left the shack and walked toward the main road. She arrived at the clinic with her wrapper soaked, hair plastered to her cheeks. She did not knock or ask. She stood in the courtyard until a nurse noticed her. I'll clean, she said. Anything you need. The nurse paused, then handed her a mop and bucket. The floors were cold, the tiles cracked, the air heavy with smells of antiseptic and fear. Amara scrubbed until her arms shook. She wiped beds, collected linen, carried water jugs. No one asked her name. No one praised her. She entered the back of the world, the cleaning world of the hospital, but she thought, better here than under shame in the shack. She donned the worn apron, the label volunteer nearly faded. She worked through the day, clutching memories as she moved. With each pass of the mop, she stripped another layer of humiliation from herself and cataloged new strength in her muscles. By afternoon, her legs ached, but her mind moved with purpose. She observed the nurses, watched how they placed beds, how they spoke gently to children, how they checked charts. She tucked each motion into her memory. Dignity was not about titles. It was about competence and presence. She believed that now. The hunger still gnawed. The cold still filled her bones. But inside, she began to build something steadier than the wall of the shack, a foundation of ability and respect. In the evening, as she closed the ward, she glimpsed Kofi being wheeled in by paramedics. The ambulance entrance doors hadn't even closed yet. The wail of sirens cut through the night. Her heart leapt. She dropped the mop, ran. Inside the corridor, she saw him on the stretcher, oxygen mask strapped, his face pale. She gasped, caught between relief and fear. The world's echo returned, her old shame, the village's whispers, the broken promises. But beneath that echo was a new one, softer, unspoken. We are still here. She pressed a hand to the glass, watched the doctors move around him, her body trembling. The breaking point had arrived, not in defeat, but in reckoning. The cold of the night seeped into her clothes. Her tears matched the rain outside. She stared at Kofi in that hospital bed, fragile and exposed. Her anger collapsed into despair. But under it, a different feeling glowed, raw, steady, real. She realized she had not been pushed from the peak of hope into the valley of failure. She had been plunged through both so that she might find something beneath. And now, as she watched him fight for breath, she made a silent vow. The shack would not define them, the shame would not define her, and the beggar would not define him. Just as she finishes sweeping one ward, an ambulance horn blares. She runs outside and sees Kofi inside, on a stretcher, oxygen mask on, paramedics rushing him in. She stepped into the clinic, not as a maid, but as the one soul who wouldn't let the child, or the patient, die. The early morning sun found its way into the narrow corridor of the city clinic, the light flickering against tall glass windows and reflecting off the polished steel of hospital equipment. It found Amara, too, and in that moment she felt both vulnerability and purpose, a strange combination she had come to know intimately. She pushed open the sliding doors and stepped into a world she had only visited as an outsider. The world of healing, urgency, life held by threads thinner than a breath. Inside, the chaos of the morning shift pressed around her like a storm. The wail of a monitor, the hushed rush of nurses on wheels, the clipped voices of doctors issuing orders. Yet there was a calm center. Kofi, lying on a stretcher in the adjacent ward, oxygen mask strapped at his face for drip steady, his eyes flickering beneath lids half closed. His collapse the previous night had brought him here, and under the bright lights, he seemed more fragile than when he walked unaided in the village square just days ago. Amara's heart hammered. The reality of their climb had brought them back to a threshold she once feared. Without hesitation, she crossed into the ward. Her uniform, a plain blouse and skirt, stood out among the scrubs and hospital coats. A nurse glanced at her, then back at Kofi. She handed Amara a damp cloth. Quickly wipe his forehead, his temps high, and the mask slipped. Amara moved, her hands steadying only when she focused on the task. She pressed the cloth to Kofi's brow, adjusted the mask strap, gently held his chin so his airway remained open. A doctor arrived moments later, scanning the monitors, checking the paperwork. He turned and looked at Amara, surprise in his eyes. "You acted fast. Who are you?" he asked, his voice calm but direct. Amara found her voice steadier than she expected. "Amara Wade," she said. I used to clean here. I've been learning. I'm someone who learned to care." She paused. "Martha trained me." The doctor's eyes flicked toward the doorway, where Martha stood quietly, arms folded, watching. Then he nodded. "Very well. We need you with vitals every 15 minutes. I'll give you a chart. He gestured to the nurse, will handle medicine. You stay with the patient." "Understood." Amara nodded. Her breath stilled as she accepted the chart. Around her the monitors beeped, the ward thrummed. Her identity had shifted. She was no longer the maid on the veranda, but a guardian of life. Down the corridor, in the waiting area beyond the glass, stood a tall figure, Mr. Adebayo. He did not stride in like a visitor. He leaned against the wall, folder in hand, tie undone, eyes red-rimmed from worry. Once a man who defined his status by luxury and command, now reduced to a father waiting, watching. His son in the next room, her husband on the bed. The irony was not lost. He observed Amara as she carried out her duties, the mop of her name badge hidden, her focus pure. When at last the doctors declared Kofi stable, the virus receding, the risk reduced, Amara stepped into the corridor to take a break. She found Mr. Adebayo standing outside, silent. Their eyes met. He stood straight, though his shoulders drooped. "Miss Wade," he said quietly. "No title, no patronizing undertone. You did what I couldn't. My daughter's health, I ignored. My son's value, I dismissed. And I overlooked you. I was wrong." Amara felt a pulse of shock. She had not anticipated apology. "Sir," she replied softly, "I never needed your money. Just your permission to care." His eyes glistened. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Then, "Thank you." He stepped back, his guard removed, his pride yielding. Amara turned and walked away, each step carrying the weight of all she once feared and all she had become. Outside the clinic, the midday sun bore down on Kofi's old begging spot. The pavement he once claimed now bore new signage. Large white banners reading, "Rehabilitation Success Story, from Beggar to Winner." A television crew arrived. Cameras, lights, microphones. The anchor's voice carried into the air. "Today we bring you the full story, from street beggar to walking man, from silent wife to caring professional." The banner fluttered in the breeze. Watchers gathered, phones raised. Amara rolled toward the spot with Kofi. She passed the cameras, her eyes forward. She caught a glimpse of the reporter adjusting the mic. "Ms. Wade," he asked. She looked at him, nodded. The moment stretched. She had become part of the narrative. Inside the clinic, she returned to her station. A small round of applause rose when Kofi walked, unassisted this time, from his bed to a chair, escorted by nurses, his brace gone. He stood, steadied, and smiled at her. The world watched, and Amara watched him. She thought of the barren shack, the pooled water, the nights of humiliation. She thought of the villagers' stares, the elders' condemnation, the flyer calling scam. She remembered her own doubt. And now here, this climb was not only for Kofi but for her. She realized that the mentor's entry wasn't just Martha's. It was her own acceptance of responsibility. She stepped into each ward, each patient's bed, each quiet moment with resolve. When the lights dimmed later, and the ward grew hushed once again, Amara sat beside Kofi in his hospital room. He reached out and squeezed her hand with his free one. "Thank you," he whispered. "No," she replied. "Thank you for teaching me who I could be." Outside the window, the street lamps flashed. The banner outside glowed faintly. The ripple had become visible. A TV camera crew arrives at the clinic. Kofi's old begging spot is now plastered with rehabilitation success story banners. The anchor says, "From beggar to winner," the full story. Redemption sometimes looks like the same stage, just with new eyes watching. The dawn light crept through the clinic's high windows, illuminating the clean corridors where Amara now walked. Not as a bride in a borrowed wrapper, not as a maid clinging to hope, but as an apprentice in her own right. The community health wing had plastered walls painted pale green, crisp line charts of human anatomy, and the low hum of clinical purpose. On the wooden desk behind the reception, a sign now read, "Apprentice Community Health Worker, T. Wade." The salary line on her contract was modest, a small monthly stipend, but significance stretched far beyond the numbers. Kofi watched from his wheelchair parked just outside the door, his expression luminous. She signed, the pen clicking sharply, and the director shook her hand with a measured smile. In that handshake was the turning of a page. But redemption rarely comes polished and ready. Later that afternoon, Amara slipped into the quiet of the staff room where the envelope awaited her. It bore the fine stationery of Mr. Adebayo, still in crisp ink. Opening it, she read his words of apology. He admitted he had judged her by broken standards, ignored her value, demeaned her in his mind and heart. He offered sponsorship for her education in community health, tuition, travel, accommodation, all expenses covered. But he expected something in return, a role in his company, perhaps mercy for his son or influence for his name. Amara folded the letter. She declined the offer of employment under him. Instead, she accepted the role she had silently carved, mentor to the young women who had dropped out of school, abandoned by tradition, overlooked by society. She accepted not charity, but partnership. The next morning she walked into the clinic's training room and said, "I refuse the job he offers. I choose this path with you." The director nodded, and the mentor role was officially added to her title. In the market that very day, the change was palpable. The early morning sun caught the badges on her chest, and the storekeepers paused their bartering as she passed. A young fruit seller called out, "Good morning, Nurse Wade." Her heart lifted. A child skipping beside his mother waved enthusiastically. The boy shouted, "Look, Nurse Wade." The mother smiled, nodded. The security guard at the clinic gate held the door for her without being asked. Kofi rolled beside her, the wheels of his chair whispering progress. For the first time, the market voices were not pity-laced or mocking. They were respectful. The village murmured about the shift in tone. Vendors greeted her by name. Children watched. The community recognized her. And with recognition came expectation. That evening, Amara stood before a class of young women in the clinic's training room. She faced a chalkboard marked with diagrams of lungs, hearts, simple pulses. The room was packed with faces that once felt invisible. Maids who had left school at 12, market girls who supported their households, daughters who had been told they were enough. She held a stethoscope, placed it gently on the chest of a volunteer student. "One beat," she said. "One breath. You can map it. You can care." The quiet hum of machines outside contrasted with the awe in the room. Hands rose as she asked her students to feel each other's pulses. The young women exchanged smiles, tentative at first, then bold. When one correctly identified the major artery on the diagram, she erupted into soft cheers. Amara stepped back and allowed their triumph. The shame of the shack, the mortgage of old failure, melted in that moment. She realized the rebuilding was happening not only in Kofi's gate, but in these lives as well. At the clinic walls, posters hung. Training, Nurse Wade's community health session. A photograph showed Amara and Kofi standing side by side. She in uniform, he in his wheelchair, which now bore a polished sticker. Completed Phase 1. The next poster read, New Trainees, Class of 25. The two of them appeared in them together. An image of partnership, not pity. Where once Kofi's chair had signaled limitation, now it signaled progress. The community saw them walking these halls, visiting the market, guiding classes. The public test was no longer hidden, it was open. Yet alongside the glory came burden. Late that night, when the clinic's lights dimmed and the halls emptied into hush, Amara sat alone in her office. The scholarship envelope lay on the desk. It bore a bold header, International Scholarship for Community Health Studies. She read the details, travel abroad, certification, leadership role, return expected. It was everything society once denied her. But she felt the pull of two directions: stay grounded, build in her village, mentor these girls, reinforce the foundation she and Kofi built, or step into the global arena, gain credentials, return with power, and possibly leave Kofi behind in wheels and ground. She looked at his wheelchair parked beside the desk, at his jacket folded on the chair. She thought of the market voices, the mother's smile, the child's wave. She thought of the class she taught, the pulses felt, the lives touched. The scholarship sat like a promise, and a trap. In the next morning's early light, Amara walked with Kofi through the market again. A vendor offered her a cup of tea. A small child giggled and asked if she could show them the stethoscope. Amara knelt and let the child listen. Kofi rolled beside them quietly, and when the child laughed at the sound of her own heartbeat, she caught his grateful gaze. The stage had changed, not to glitter, but to real life. But in her mind, the scholarship envelope pressed renewal and risk. She realized their public test was not complete, it had just grown larger. That afternoon, the training class concluded its first module, Understanding the Body. The young women hugged each other. Amara gathered them in a circle. She addressed them. Today you learned that the body is not just flesh and bone. It is story. It is memory. It is future. They nodded, some with tears. She looked at their faces and saw what she had once denied herself. When a mentor role ended for the day, Kofi wheeled out into the corridor. A reporter approached him. Mr. Wade, people call you an inspiration. What do you say? He smiled, quiet but certain. I say we're just getting started. The cameras flashed. Amara stood with him, badge gleaming. She placed a hand on his shoulder. The world watched. In her apartment that evening, Amara placed the scholarship envelope on the table between them. Kofi looked at it, his expression open, his voice low. What will you choose? She looked back at him. This was her partner, not her burden. She picked up the envelope, turned it slowly. She whispered, There's more to build here. But I will not walk away from what we began. The night settled around them, the lamps low, the market distant humming. Her choice did not yet finish, but the test moved into wider light. Late at night, she receives a sealed envelope. International Scholarship for Community Health Studies. Her ticket abroad, but a choice must be made. They once doubted her presence. Now they record her words. Amara approached the stage under the bright lights of the Voices of the Forgotten conference. Her heart steady though the memory of her past trembled beneath her skin. The hall was filled with hundreds of faces, advocates, NGO representatives, journalists. Eyes focused, phones at the ready. She stood behind the podium, her badge T. Wade, apprentice nurse, caught the glare of a spotlight, and for the first time, the label felt like merit instead of mocking. She looked out at the audience, a sea of intent faces, cameras rolling, the world witnessing what once whispered. She cleared her throat, drew in a slow breath, and began. I once thought my worth was the broom in my hand, the mop beneath my feet, the shadows behind the veranda. But today I know my worth was the hand I offered, the heart I heard, the hope I held. The applause that followed washed across the hall, not polite but real. Her words echoed in rooms far beyond the walls. The hashtag from A to Healer began to flicker on screens, shared by livestream watchers thousands of miles away. News outlets picked up the story. The headline read, "Maid becomes healer, a transformation of worth." Amara stood quietly after leaving the stage, her hands folded in front of her, absorbing the moment. Beside her, Kofi grinned. No longer the beggar, now walking man. No longer her limitation, now her equal. Later that evening, the gala banquet glowed under chandeliers. Awards were lined up on a long table. The trophies prepared for individuals who changed lives. When Amara's name was announced, the hall rose. She stepped forward and accepted the plaque, Hero of Health, a child figure clasping a heart raised high. She held it like a flag, the heart a symbol she once thought unreachable. Cameras flashed, and the honorees clustered for photos. In one frame, Mr. Adebayo appeared at her side, his protective posture replaced by humility and warmth. He embraced her, for once not patronizingly, but in simple recognition. At her shoulder stood Amani, the young girl whose life had sparked this entire journey, teary-eyed and proud. The image circulated across social channels. Daughter, maid, savior, beggar, client, mentor. The world recorded her words now, not as a curiosity, but as a catalyst. The next day, Amara rose early and walked through the clinic corridors. Staff greeted her by name. Patients smiled at the badge. At the market on her way home, vendors paused their haggling to wave. Children ran to her, shouting, "Nurse Wade." The title stuck, not because she sought it, but because she earned it. Kofi wheeled beside her, his step not yet perfect but his spirit unbroken. The pair who had once been looked down on were now walking among the honored. Amara realized that restoration was not merely about returning to place. It was about stepping into a new one. That afternoon she sat in the office, the Hero of Health trophy on the desk, beside her contract renewal form. She touched both the silver child figure and the signature line where she would commit another year. She thought of the nights of shame, the shack, the tears, the beggar she once rejected. As she held the trophy, she felt the past and future fold into one. The award was not just a recognition, it was a responsibility, a symbol that the climb was still ongoing. When evening came, she returned to their home. Kofi's wheelchair parked at the threshold, the room simpler but quieter than ever before. She placed the trophy on the shelf. Kofi watched her, his hands folded, his breathing even. She sat beside him and presented the envelope from the scholarship program. "Your studies begin next term," it read. A shimmer of possibilities flickered across her face. The next chapter beckoned. The applause, the recognition, the glimmer of global stage, it all led here. And yet, with it came the question, to stay or to go. That evening she opens a scholarship offer letter. "Your studies begin next term, the next chapter begins, but will she stay or go?" She was once the maid mocked for not reading. Now, she's the woman writing new chapters for others. The sun hung low over the dusty path of her old neighborhood as Amara walked slowly toward the mango tree where she used to sneak away when the weight of village life pressed too heavy. The children played beneath it now, laughter bursting like sunlight through the leaves, their bare feet kicking dust and chasing dreams unaware of the past shadow. She reached the tree and placed her palm against its trunk, feeling the rough bark press in her fingertips, the ridges shaped by years of storm and season. In that moment she saw her own reflection, not the girl who had served behind the mansion gates, but a woman who had stepped forward out of invisibility. The memory of whispers, of being the maid who couldn't read, flickered against the bark, then receded as she drew in a quiet breath. The surrounding houses were still the same small clay-walled dwellings with tin roofs rusting at the edges, the same ground TV of dust and roots. A woman selling groundnuts nodded respectfully as Amara passed. A boy who once taunted her paused mid-skip and offered a shy wave. The distance between them and her had shifted, not simply in standing, but in perception. She no longer carried shame, but presence. The mango tree rustled in the breeze, as if acknowledging the journey. Her reflection glowed in the pool of afternoon light. She touched the bark again, forehead pressing gently. "This is now part of me," she thought. The path behind her didn't have to define the road ahead. Later that afternoon, Amara returned to the clinic where she now held her role not as maid or helper, but as mentor, guide, exemplar. The corridor she once swept, the wall she once cleaned in silence, now bore the badge on her chest. T. Wade, mentor, community health. She walked through the tall glass doors with steady steps, receding footsteps of the past fading behind her. She entered the training room where a group of young women, maids, market helpers, girls who had dropped out of school, sat on plastic chairs arranged in a half circle. Their eyes brightened when she entered. She stood at the front and said in a voice steady but soft, "Your worth was never in what you lacked. It was always in what you give." She paused, let the sentences settle. The girls shifted in their seats. Some looked uncertain, some hopeful. She reached into her bag and withdrew a stethoscope, a simple one, used but clean. She placed it around her neck and said, "Let's begin with listening." She walked around the circle, handed the stethoscope to one young woman, and guided her hand to a partner's chest. "Feel the beat," she said. "That rhythm is more than life. It is value." The room hummed. The journey of a stethoscope across shoulders became a lesson of dignity. A girl asked, "But I never finished school." Amara looked up and met her eyes. "Then start here," she answered. "Because caring transcends certificates." The young woman's lips curved into a smile. In that room, the echo of her own past, the shame of being uneducated, met the possibility of transformation. Compassion became curriculum. She remembered the little girl, Imani, from long ago. The child who had said quietly as Amara held her hand, "You saved my life by listening." Those words, so small, yet so seismic, replayed now in her mind with clarity. Listening, she realized, had been her first act of care. The ear, the quiet presence, the attention to breath. These had been more than kindness. They had been the beginning of her purpose. Compassion emerged not from status or degree, but from noticing the unspoken, staying when everyone walked away, and trusting that value is not assigned, but revealed. She let those thoughts fill her as the training session ended, the women filing out with new notebooks, new hope shining in their eyes. The maps of lungs, charts of pulse, all had become tools of empowerment. Later, in a quiet office corner of the clinic, Amara reviewed footage of the conference where she had spoken before hundreds. The banner behind her read, "Voices of the Forgotten," and she stood at the podium declaring, "I once thought my worth was the broom in my hand." Applause had risen then. Phones recorded. Hashtag Front Healer trending. News outlets covering her story. Now she reviewed the trophies lined behind her desk, the certificate of apprenticeship, the mentorship role. The transformation was real, but she knew the climb was not yet complete. She sipped water, looked at her badge still pinned to her blouse, and whispered to herself, "Recognition is not the end, it is a doorway." When twilight came, she recorded a message for her channel. Her voice rang clear in the soft glow of the studio light. What would you do if someone else's child depended on you? Have you ever been underestimated, but then proved them wrong? Drop your story in the comments. Someone needs to hear it. She paused, waiting for the words to land. She thought of viewers clicking the video, reading the description, pressing like and share, not just for a story, but for belief. She believed then that the platform she had once feared could become a place of empowerment. She turned off the camera, leaned back. The quiet hum of the equipment matched the quiet of her heart. Courage had a new stage. Recollecting all of it, the shack in the storm, the begging seat, the broken drawer, the therapy sessions, the market respect, the conference stage, Amara realized her journey had become a living moral. Education opens doors, but compassion walks through them first. She said the sentence aloud, the words tasting like hope. Education had granted her credentials, but compassion had opened the path. She thought of the young women she now mentored. She thought of the child she once held. She thought of the village she once left behind. She understood now that her story was not about escaping her past. It was about transforming it. The mop handle, the wheelchair wheels, the chalk on pavement, they all became symbols of something greater. Rebirth through empathy. As she rose from her chair and walked across the corridor to the training room's door, the badge on her chest glinted under the clinic lights. One gentle step, Then another, her footsteps echoing softly on the tile. Behind her, the city of Lagos stirred, distant horns, neon light in the cityscape, traffic weaving like rivers of possibility. The mango tree in her old neighborhood stood silent in the gathering darkness. The market closed, children returning home. And somewhere beyond those walls, another story awaited. Someone else unseen, untold, underestimated. She stepped through the clinic doors and breathed deeply, feeling the weight of responsibility settle but not crush. Her transformation complete? Not quite. It was ongoing. She realized that writing new chapters doesn't mean ending the story. It means beginning again. She smiled, looked ahead, and walked into the next class waiting for her. As she steps through the clinic doors, her badge gleams in the light. Behind her, the city of Lagos stirs, another story waiting. Before you scroll away, ask yourself this. Have you ever been treated like you didn't matter, just because of your clothes, your job, or your silence? Have you ever loved someone enough to fight for them, even when the world laughed? If your story could give someone hope tonight, would you share it? Tell us below, because sometimes one comment can save another person's will to rise. And if this story touched something deep in you, don't just like. Stand with us. Subscribe. Share. Be part of the change.